Anahaga. Welcome to Native Lens. I'm your host, Rochelle Coulee, and today we have a wonderful guest, Michaela Madrid, and she, excuse me, she serves as the operation manager for Sovereign Bodies Institute, located in Northern California. And she's a member of the Lower Brule Lakota Sioux tribe and was born and raised in South Dakota. She has a bachelor's degree in political science and sociology from Black Hills State University. She has a master's degree in public policy, specializing in intergovernmental relations with tribal governments from Portland State University. And prior to that, to work into SBI, Michaela has worked for the Institute for Tribal Government of Interior, Indian Affairs, Office of Self-Governance, and Michaela has helped coordinate several community MMIWG2, missing and murdered and Indigenous women, and G2 awareness events in conjunction with members of the Portland Native community, and also has assisted with the Oregon State Police Task Force on Missing and Murdered Native women as a graduate student. So she's passionate and advocate, interested in combining traditional cultural values and governance strategies to shape policy that will improve everyday lives of our Indigenous people. Welcome, Michaela. Thank you for joining me. How are you doing this morning?
Yeah, I'm doing good. The sun is shining. We've had some really wonderful rain the last few days. So, living in Northern California, it's kind of super rainy one day and then we get the nice sun the next day. So, it's been really nice.
Yeah, you live in one of the most beautiful places on earth, and you're so blessed to be there. Those big red forests, and so beautiful. So, Michaela, you live in, or you work for the Sovereign Bodies Institute. Tell me what your job's about.
Yeah, so Sovereign Bodies Institute is a nonprofit, and we do research on ending violence against Indigenous people. And then we also provide direct services to survivors of violence and also the families of those who have a missing or murdered loved one. And so my role as operations manager is a little more on the administrative kind of logistics side of our work, kind of keeping all of our papers straight and organized. And then also just kind of filling in on all of our projects when we need a little extra support.
Wow, sounds very complicated and smart.
Well, thank you.
But go into detail. What are these projects that the Sovereign Bodies Institute incorporate?
Yeah, so we, like I said, we're an Indigenous nonprofit, and we really hold true to those values of being Indigenous. And so we try to be a lot different than your traditional researchers, where we see ourselves as the experts that set out to kind of educate everyone else. And instead, we really seek to build a platform for those who have been directly impacted by this issue, to be able to speak and to share their experiences, because we recognize that, academic education and knowledge is really great and it's important and has its place, but real life experience, when it comes to having a relative who's gone missing or murdered, and not really understanding how the system works and having to just kind of figure it out as you go, that's a completely different education and experience than somebody who studied about it in school.
Right. So can you tell the viewers, maybe they don't have a background and understanding of missing Indigenous women, and why is that such a precedence that in the Indian country of why it's so important to bring it out into the front lines?
Yeah, and so this issue is one I often get asked a lot, like, when did this issue start? And there's really no like definite start date. It started when the Europeans came to this land and started colonizing and trying to gather land for themselves. And so,
Mm-hmm.
as Indigenous people, from since the beginning, we've known that our women go missing without any sort of explanation. I think that before we had kind of the power of social media and technology to really connect, we couldn't really see those patterns as much. And now that
Mm-hmm.
we kind of live in a more connected world, we've really realized that this is an issue that it impacts almost every Native community. And so the movement, the NMIW movement as like an official name, really started in Canada. And so I remember
Mm-hmm.
in 2015, I was in my undergrad at Black Hills State, and I was in a contemporary issues in American Indian life class, and we had
Mm-hmm.
learned about the Canadian inquiry. And so at that point, they had identified that there were some, I want to say 2,000 or more missing Native Canadian women. And so as a junior in my undergrad, I was like, well, it's time we start talking about this in the United States. For my research project, I'm going to find how many missing and murdered Indigenous women there are here in the US. And so as I got to doing my own research, I realized that this was just such a huge research, and pretty much have done all of my studies on the issue ever since that class. And so
Mm-hmm.
really a complicated issue. It's one of complicated jurisdiction. So basically, when our relatives go missing, we don't know who the right person to call is all the time, and law enforcement doesn't always know, because when it comes to crime in Indian country, whose jurisdiction it is to solve the crime depends on where the crime happened, who is the victim if they were Native, and who is the perpetrator if they were Native. And so it's such a complicated maze that you have to go through to even know who to report, that folks fall through the cracks. And it's also an issue steeped in racism, where when we report our missing loved ones to the police, they say, oh, she's probably just out partying, she'll come back. And when someone goes missing, that first 48 hours is imperative to being able to find that person. And so
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, a lot of Native people spend that first 48 hours just trying to convince law enforcement that they're actually missing. And so we miss out on a lot of valuable time. And then because of this cycle that has happened, it's resulted in a society of Native Americans where we don't trust law enforcement. And so we often go
Mm-hmm.
to court when we experience violence because we don't believe anything's going to happen. So because of that, we really don't know how many missing and murdered Indigenous people there are in the United States.
I need a Kleenex. Where's a Kleenex?
Yeah, I felt like if I could pass it to you.
Gosh, I mean, this is such a heavy topic. If anybody of our viewers are watching, if you can post and ask questions if you'd like to ask us. Then from there, what is your job so is your job if that's what I know of a case, I go to your Sovereign Bodies Institute. Do I call you? How many institutes are there out there that are doing the same thing you're doing?
Yeah, so at Sovereign Bodies Institute, we really focus on taking care of the families and survivors
Mm,
and also doing research. So, one of the problems with this issue is that there's almost no data collected. And so, it's
mm,
really hard to get policymakers to listen if there's no data. And then collecting that data is really difficult because it's not there. And really, what you need is relationships with families and survivors. And so that is what is really the main focus of our work, is making sure that families and survivors feel supported. And we don't really there's no statute of limitations on grief. And so we don't really set time limits of when you're eligible for services. services. And so we don't necessarily have like a list of services because we're really flexible and we're really just trying to meet folks where they're at. So sometimes we do go to law enforcement with our clients and we advocate on their behalf. We'll write press releases for them. We can provide emergency financial assistance. Right now, we're doing a holiday gift drive because we recognize that a lot of times when a mother specifically goes missing or is murdered, a lot of times the family members step up to take care of their children, and they don't always have the resources to do that because they weren't planning on, having to support a child. So we try to do everything that we can by like providing Christmas presents, just little things like that. We also have kind of weekly beading circles. We have a 24-hour emotional support line. So we really do a wide range of things, and it's really and just raising awareness. And so then as far as other organizations doing this work, there is, because it's taken so long for the government to recognize this issue, there has been a really huge grassroots organization network that's working on this issue. And so in almost every Native community, you will find a group of advocates that are working in their own communities, sometimes leading searches, working with families. And so, yes, this is definitely a grassroots movement, and we just learned that we had to take care of it for ourselves because the government wasn't going to do that for us.
So what happens in a scenario why it's so difficult to arrest somebody that is not from native land reservations? What is the problem with that? And then why and I think also the pipeline, all those industries go along with that, contribute to it. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really difficult because each crime in Indian country is a case by case basis of whose responsibility it is to solve, and it differs by reservation to reservation because different tribes have different treaties with different rights, and so that's why it's really important when we do this work that we work at a local level. Sometimes there's this push to do these big national studies and national work, but what we found is when you do a national report, a lot of times the kind of recommendations that follow from there, they don't work in every community because it's completely different context of being in Alaska versus being in California. And so it's really important, but most tribes do not have jurisdiction over non-native offenders. And so there's been works to kind of reverse that through policy. The Violence Against Women's Act reauthorization in 2013 sought to close some of those loopholes and give tribes jurisdiction over these offenders. But the problem with that is that there were so many requirements with VAWA that most tribes can't afford to take over that jurisdiction. And so a lot of times, even when tribes are given more of that sovereign authority to protect their people, they're not given the resources or the funds that they need to do that. And so that's why we call ourselves Sovereign Bodies Institute, because we are all about sovereignty. We're about body sovereignty, where everybody has the full right to say what happens and does not happen with their own body, but also tribes, as tribal nations, we have sovereignty too. So all of our recommendations and our work is always aiming to strengthen tribal sovereignty, because we recognize that this issue was created by colonial governments, and so it can't be solved by them. It needs to be solved by us.
And it's going to take a while. It's been hundreds and hundreds of years that this has been happening, and it's just going to take us some time to do that. So what are your suggestions for families in that healing process? And as a community members, what is our responsibility, or how can we contribute and help with these families?
So at Sovereign Bodies, all of our reports and resources that we publish are completely free to the public. So on May 5th of this past year, we released an organizing toolkit. And
Mhm.
so that has
Mm.
advice directly from families and survivors about how to do this work. We've got data sheets in there. We have little workshops to help folks organize. So I'd really recommend folks take a look at that. But more than anything, healing looks really different to everybody.
Right.
And so I think the most important thing is to have those individual relationships with folks. Because for some people, it's healing to, post the name of their loved one and, keep their memory alive that way. And then in other cultures, that's a really big cultural taboo to share names and photos of the ones who have passed on.
Mhm.
So it's hard to say, like, this is the one thing that you need to do to heal. Rather, you need to develop that relationship and ask them, like, what do they need to heal? And then be able to provide those resources that way.
Yeah, I think that's important because I think that sometimes people mean well, and we think because we tend to, what I've noticed, people tend to lump all Indigenous people in the same category when we are different, have different cultures, we have similarities, but there's different cultures and beliefs. So you have to respect that, and you can't assume, oh, well, this is what they need because, you know, this is what I learned or something from
Mhm,
this tribe, but that's not always true. Everyone has a different protocol.
mhm,
And so learning from that
mhm,
is important as well. And what is their needs? What are
mhm,
your needs? How can I support you?
mhm. Absolutely.
So do you as a what do I want to ask? What I want to ask is, as a coordinator, or you're in your job, how do you yourself deal with this? Because it's a hard job.
Yeah, and so it is really hard, absolutely. And that was one of my concerns as I kind of stepped more and more into this work, that I am a very empathetic person, and sometimes I have a hard time not taking on all of those feelings that others around me have. And
Hmm.
so, one thing that I've really done is to set kind of clear boundaries. The thing with our work is it doesn't really work from 9 to 5, so sometimes it is important to be available after hours. And so I do always have my phone on and I'm available. But just being able to step back and take that time for myself, to give myself my weekend so that I can relax and recharge. And honestly, just taking part in some of our services that we offer, like our beading circles and whatnot, are also just as healing for me. And then seeking out those support networks too, and attending my own support circles where I'm not
Hmm.
facilitating, is really important. But honestly, it's not as hard emotionally as I thought it would be, because it's so rewarding at the same time. We do
Hmm.
have a lot of cases that, don't end great, but even in my short time here, we've had a few cases that have been successes, and we found somebody. And
Hmm.
so I think that in this work, it's really important to celebrate your successes, because that is kind of the fuel that you need to get through the harder times.
Right. To continue to be an advocate for families. And so, because you're based in California, is it just for that area or throughout the whole country?
Yeah, so we work nationally. Most our staff is pretty spread out throughout the country. So we've got some
Okay.
staff in Minnesota, we have someone in Montana, we have folks in Canada, and then a handful of people here in California. So we really try to build those communities and relationships where our staff are located, and to provide services that way. But our services do, anybody in the US, Canada, or Mexico is eligible for
Mm.
this.
Hmm.
As part of asserting our sovereignty, we don't recognize colonial notions of borders or indigeneity.
Yeah.
So we are happy to serve folks from Canada and from South and Central America.
Wow, that's that's wonderful, and I'm glad to hear that Mexico is included because they are our indigenous brothers and sisters who also are in need of our helps and support. So from there, is there anything positive happening? How do we get the government to step in and support us, and how do we, I guess the FBI should be a part of this, and why haven't they been?
So, in the past year or so, there has been a lot more interest from federal and state governments to address this issue. We've seen a lot of states passing their own task forces, and then there's also the Operation Lady Justice, which is the federal task force. The problem with that is that in those instances, you have the people and the institutions who have created this situation in the first place that are now trying to find the solutions. So since the United States became a country, they have been telling the Native Americans what is good for you, that we are your parents and we will take care of you and we know what's best for you. And what we're saying is no, like it is our time to step up and to find those solutions. And so when people ask me what is the role of the state in this movement, it really is to step aside and to give us the space and the resources to do this work. A lot of times, for example, Native Americans by race have the highest rate of police brutality out of any other race. And so that is a really big issue that contributes to the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis. However, in a lot of these state reports, there is no mention of police brutality. And it makes sense in a way that if it's the police who are leading this research, that the folks they interview aren't going to feel comfortable sharing with them the negative experiences they've had with police and the violence perpetuated against them by police. And so that's why it's really important to have Indigenous researchers like us to be the ones holding those interviews and building those relationships, because there's just a lot more information that folks feel comfortable sharing with us that they will never feel comfortable sharing with the federal or state.
Yes. Sorry about that. I forgot to take the phone out. My husband still uses his phones for his business, and it's in here, and I forget to take it out sometimes.
I haven't heard a landline for a while, actually.
I know, isn't it nice? No, so watch. Charlie Brown. So you are you a nonprofit organization, and how do you receive the fundings for your organization?
So we are a nonprofit. As a policy, we will not accept funds from any colonial government. And the reason for that is that we believe in the sacredness of our data, and that data isn't always seen sacred by people. And so with the database that we carry, each statistic, each number is a person and is a human. And so we believe that it is our responsibility to be the caretakers of that data. And also just with our mission of serving Canadian and Mexico and South and Central America, we knew that if we did accept federal funds, that we would be limited in our aims to be able to do that. And so not accepting federal or state funds really allows us to be a lot more flexible and to go right to the people that we serve without having to jump through a whole lot of bureaucratic processes, because we find a lot of those processes that families have to go through are really traumatizing. And so we try to do everything that we can in our processes to not replicate that trauma, and to make
Mm.
it as simple and accessible as possible to the folks who need it the most.
So
So
where are you getting your funds then, and how can we help you?
yeah, absolutely. So we are ran pretty much entirely on donations and philanthropic dollars. We will only accept funds from philanthropies that align with our mission. So we won't take funds from any source that gets their funding from extractive industries. And we
Mm,
really
okay.
try to hold ourselves to a high standard when it comes to funding so that we can continue this work in a good way and with the sacredness that it deserves.
Can you give an example? I mean, I don't know if you could tell, but like in a company that you just, who said, we'll give you some money, for instance, like Bill Gates,
Mm.
and whether you accept him or not, can you give an example of a company that wanted to give you something but there was a story behind it, or what they lead,
Mm.
or the type of work they do,
Mm.
that you've turned down?
So I can't think of any names specifically, but in general, with the extractive industries, there's a lot of philanthropies that are tied to gas and oil revenues because
Mhm.
it's almost a way to kind of cleanse their, grief or their whatever you want to call
Yeah, their
it.
guilt or what they're doing, and so
Yeah,
trying to make up for it through something else.
exactly. And so with extractive industries, we did a report, which is also available on our website, that looks at the intersection of the Keystone XL pipeline and the MMIW issue in those states that it goes through. And we
Mhm.
found a pretty strong correlation between where these man camps are located and high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous people. So
Okay.
for folks who are listening who might not know what a man camp is, so when they build these pipelines, they're in really rural places, and honestly, even the placement of these pipelines is racist. So, for example, with the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota, the initial plan of it was to go through a very populated white city, and the city organized because they didn't want the pipeline to impact their water, and so as a result, the pipeline was then diverted to go through tribal lands so that it could impact that community instead. So there's an example right there of the racism of just
Mhm.
where they're sitting. But then when they're building these man camps, they're in these really rural places that are often close to tribal communities. And so there are hundreds and thousands of men who live in these temporary camps, these man camps, and they work on the pipeline and they stay there in their time. And the problem is that these folks live a pretty transient lifestyle. They move around kind of wherever the next pipeline is. So they have no real accountability to the communities that they live in. And so
Mm.
they can cause a lot of harm and not have to pay the impacts of it. They also recognize that there is this gray area of jurisdiction when you commit crimes on tribal lands. So, folks who want to commit these really terrible things know that if they do it in tribal lands, they're less likely to get caught. And so, this all kind of creates a situation where Indigenous folks are really in danger around these man camps because of human
Mm.
trafficking and things like that. And so yes, that is the main reason why we won't accept funds from extractive industries because we believe that they are directly contributing to this crisis.
Yeah, it's a big problem, and it's just too bad. Do you see a resolution for this? If if in the best case scenario, how would you see that it would work perfectly in order to protect the men and women?
Yeah, and I'm grateful that you said the men and women there. In our work, we use the acronym MMIWG2, and that stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit Individuals. And so
Mm-hmm.
we recognize that as much as violence that kind of cis hetero women face in this issue, our two-spirit relatives face it just as much, if not at
Mm-hmm.
higher rate. And
Yeah.
there's been less data on those. And so that's one area that we're really focusing on, to bring more awareness. And so I think a perfect world for me would be an Indigenous world, one where
Mm-hmm.
we're the ones that are leading this work and it looks different in every community. We get to make the decisions for ourselves, what works best for us. And it's also a world with proactive services. I dream of a world where kids can just be kids and they don't have to learn about all of these, to look out, to protect themselves, to witness this violence, because
Mm-hmm.
we know just when you have those experiences at a young age, that really sets you up for the rest of your life.
Yeah.
And so my dream world is one that kids don't have to heal from their childhood and they're just able to be children and to play and to have fun and to be creative.
Right. And not having to worry about anything else. I mean, that would be a beautiful thing, and it ought to happen and should.
Mm.
Um, so, are there any advice that you would like to give, or words of wisdom before we say goodbye to our guests?
I guess that I would just really encourage folks to listen to your heart and to listen to your gut. And if there is an issue, no matter what it is that you feel especially passionate about, there is a place for you in that movement. This movement in particular, there are so many things that we need. We need Indigenous lawyers. We need Indigenous community workers. We need folks with this life experience of being an Indigenous people working in roles where you're making decisions that impact the lives of others. And so even if folks around you aren't doing the same things that you want to do, that's okay. Like, it's okay to go out into the world and to make your own path. You're not, beholden to anybody's ideas of you. And so my life, I've always just kind of taken it one step at a time. I've always been looking out for different opportunities and things that felt right with my spirit that I needed to do. And it's really worked out for me so far. So I think as long as you have a clear heart and clear intentions, and you just keep trying to do good in this world, good things will happen to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Michaela. It's been an honor to have you here. I know you could say so much more, and it needs to be like a segment, to talk. But maybe we'll do that next year. Have segments discussing different topics of this being proactive in this. What do you? It's not, I don't want to say the whole word. So in this, help me fill that up.
Uh,
Genre, no, that sounds like
movement.
music. Movement. Yes,
There you
that's
go.
the word I want. Thank you. So that we could be a part of that movement and really be these amazing human beings and making things happen for our people.
Mm.
It's time for us to all stand up and really, really be active in helping in any form, any way we can.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. There's space for everyone at the
yeah,
table, and the
yeah,
more of us we have, the less weight that we all have to carry individually. So,
exactly. Thank you so much, Michaela, and thank you all the audience for joining us. Have a great weekend.